Welcome to this panel discussion on feeding the demand for cell and gene therapy production. So, the FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb described regenerative medicines as being no longer the stuff of science fiction last year. And since then, a spate of approvals of CAR T-cell and gene therapies seem to prove this. With both big biopharma and biotech throwing scientists and funds towards these next-generation therapies, CDMOs have jumped upon the opportunity and invested in capacity and expertise. So in this discussion, we're going to talk about some of these third parties, how they're supporting the industry, how they're supporting growth in the industry. And we have, at the moment, two panelists. We're still waiting for a third who may or may not join us. But on my far left over there, we have Alan Moore, who is the VP and Commercial Chief for Advanced Therapies at WuXi AppTec. And next to him, Ohad Carnielli, the CEO and co-founder of AtvIO Biotech, which is a privately held Israeli-based CDMO focused on PD upscaling, automation and virus manufacturing for cell therapies. Alan, do you want to give the audience just a brief taste of what you do in the field?
Sure. Good afternoon. Thanks for attending. My role at WuXi AppTec is around setting up strategic manufacturing partnerships with our client companies or prospective client companies. One of the realities of supporting advanced therapies is that the contracting model has changed pretty dramatically. And that's due in part to the regulatory accelerators that exist for cell and gene therapies. So more often than not, potential clients are faced with the challenge of establishing early and late phase manufacturing capabilities. And because of the regulatory environment, often clients have the opportunity to move directly from early clinical studies into pivotal clinical studies. And therefore, they're looking for manufacturing resources which are available to meet commercial requirements, both in terms of scale and in terms of quality systems. So my role is to help navigate that landscape with our manufacturing capabilities.
And Ohad, sort of the same question for you. I know as well as being the CEO and co-founder of AtvIO, you work very closely. You're the co-chair of the ISCT, the International Society for Cell and Gene Therapy. So please give me just a brief synopsis of how you work.
All right. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. I've been in the cell and gene therapy industry or science since my earliest days. So late 90s, beginning of 2000. And I've been evolving with this industry where my former job was Vice President of Technology and Manufacturing at a company called Pluristem, where one of the things I think they were pioneering is really innovating in manufacturing. So they were one of the earlier ones that said we need to manufacture and develop manufacturing technologies. That was my group that was doing that. And what I saw in this field, how it evolves, being a true believer in it, is that the next challenge after the science is going to be the manufacturing. And I think it hit us even stronger than we had expected now with a CAR T that erupted so fast and got to clinic and to market as fast as you could even dream. But that opened a huge gap because we're basically doing science, lab science, and now we want to translate it very fast into the clinic. And I think this is part of my other side of the activity. So our company, that's what it does. It does automation, it does innovation. We're looking at how to manufacture products. How can you make a scientific process, make it a real manufactured product, automated, closed, etc., that really can meet the demand and bring this therapy to market.
Well, let's try and answer some of those questions. So, going back last August, I've said Scott Gottlieb's comments. When Novartis' Kymriah was approved, it was a huge moment for the lay and the business media. How did industry and I guess academia react to that? And I guess Ohad, if you want to go first from your position at the ISCT, how did industry react?
So I think the people that were in the industry were pleasantly surprised because we all, of course, wanted things to get to market. We've been talking through the Process and Product Development Committee, for example, that I've been chairing for the past 4 years, and being part of it for another 5. We've been talking about it. We've been publishing stuff with BPI around manufacturability of cell therapies for years. But the changes were very incremental, very small. And none of us knew how, oh, here we go, our panelists. So none of us really knew how can we get that to that point. And what happened with the CAR T, with this Kite Novartis approvals, is that it changed dramatically the industry, because suddenly the needed funds and the needed partners starting floating in. So if you look at the billions of dollars that went into this industry, and the big companies, so the GEs, the Thermos, the Sartorius, all these companies stepping in and saying, we want to be part of this game. 5 years ago, we were begging them to be part of the game, and we were last on the list, even though strategically it was interesting, but there was no money there. Now suddenly there's money, there's need, and this would push the industry forward.
Thank you, Ohad. Let me just quickly introduce David Brindley, who has joined us. He is a senior research fellow at the University of Oxford, and earlier today he was described to me as a cell therapy evangelist. So, David, straight in, we're talking about the approval last August of Novartis's Kymriah, and I'm just trying to look how industry and academia reacted to that. What were your thoughts?
So firstly, apologies for being late. I think we should go into the map business rather than manufacturing. I think that it's clearly a big step forward for the industry. It's opened lots of doors and made people realise there may be some substance to all the hype. I wouldn't say that it's going to be a huge commercial success in the short term. That product alone is not going to make much margin, if any. But what it has done is said, actually, we can now build the cars to go on the roads. Please help us make more roads. So I think to the point Ohad made, it's made people really sit up, listen, and realise there's something more here. And almost, I think there's going to be a second wave of cell and gene therapy in the same way we saw, with the first gene therapies back in Gelsing, and now we're back, almost 20 years later to commercial success. I think we'll see the same with cell therapies as gene therapies.
Alan, as at WuXi, when Kymriah was approved, was everyone sitting back going, cha-ching, everything we've been working for in our cell and gene therapy unit is going to pay off here? Was there some sort of excitement? Was there some sort of surge in demand even?
Well, I think one of the things that we were preparing for was what we would refer to as catastrophic success. And the reality is that for autologous production, as Ohad pointed out, there are some manufacturing gaps. There's some realities that are required for efficient GMP manufacturing and being able to support the number of patients that are required. So our actual investment in building expanded facilities preceded the approval. We saw that was coming down the pike, and actually had gotten involved with CAR T therapies when our management committed to it, and actually was investing in some of the early companies developing CAR Ts. I think that it solidified the recognition in our company that we had to build development capabilities and unique quality control paradigms that were going to function at scale for the challenge of autologous products. And we've been supporting some products that had very limited shelf lives. While it was a bellwether event, I can go back to the days at Genzyme when we were working with a patient-specific ID vaccine for B-cell lymphoma and multiple myeloma that we were producing for phase 3 clinical studies. And the realities of establishing those processes began to emerge then. So we weren't taken completely by surprise. we're certainly enthusiastic and are eager, to participate in the maturation of the manufacturing processes.
I want to park the thought about the manufacturing gaps for the moment, but I think it's something we're going to come back to. I want to bring up the idea of these innovators in cell and gene therapies manufacturing them in-house. So Novartis, they're making Kymriah from their facility, I think in New Jersey. Gilead, who bought Kite, and then straight after had Yescarta approved. That's being manufactured in-house. Are pharma firms, our big pharma firms, trying to not outsource the manufacture of these products? And Ohad, what are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on that are a bit, I change my opinion as I go. Because if you would have asked me a few years ago, when I was in Florestan, for example, we developed our own manufacturing, and we invested tons of money and time in developing that. And then I was a true believer that that's the way to go. Because this is a unique product, and we're learning out of it, and we're improving our product, and if we reach market, we'll be ready, etc. On the other hand, now when I look at it from a different perspective, from a CDMO perspective, it's different. Because the challenge that these companies have in developing their science, developing their clinical, developing their even logistics in the hospitals, nobody thinks about how really, okay, we'll manufacture 10,000 dosages of CAR-T. How do you really administer it in the hospital? How do you take care of that little logistics inside the hospital to make sure that they get the right product on time, etc.? So there's so many challenges for these companies. It doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. There's enough knowledge today out there. It's still limited, but there's a few groups. There's, of course, WuXi. There's us, so the Orgenesis group, MasterCell group. There's knowledge there. There's still capacity. There is lack of capacity, but there still is enough. And people think that, you know what, I can build a clean room. It's $1 million. Why not build it by myself? Why should I go to CMO for $3 million and do my phase one? I'll do it by myself. But then you find out that that's not only limiting, that's much more expensive. You're defocusing your efforts. And even if you think you have a lot of money, there's a lot of gap to go through. So I would suggest to these companies, find your partner, find your manufacturing partner that knows how to manufacture, that knows all the logistics behind it, knows all the regulatory that is evolving and changing. Focus on your clinics, focus on your logistics, focus on getting your product to market, and not on the other side, because it's too big of a task for any company, including the big ones. And I doubt it that, even Novartis started with their own, now they're looking for others to help them. And if you really think of what Kite is going to build, 20 sites in the US and another 1,000 or 100 in the world to really reach the market, probably they'll need the hybrid model. They'll probably need the help from others. So I think the right way is to focus on your targets and let others do the manufacturing.
Well, I think as the only person here that doesn't represent a CMO, I think...
I was coming to you.
So firstly, I do completely agree with Ohad, and I actually think that the in-source versus outsource is exactly the same as the auto-allo debate. Frankly, it's pointless, right? It's only driven by three things as far as I can see. One is capital, one is human capital, so people, and the final one is complete chance. So if we take the capital issue, yes, if it wasn't a shortage of money, we'd all go and build rockets, right? Who cares? But the human capital is where it's difficult. So if we look at Gritstone, for example, that have been quite successful in building their own facility, they've been very, very lucky with some fantastic hires who come from a CMO background. And obviously it's chance they happen to have a facility, and in the case of Novartis, they've inherited one and then got the Dendrian facility as well. So I think this sort of trinity of people, money, and of chance will continue. I think in the longer term, if we look 20 years down the line, pharma will want to bring it in-house because it's a credible threat. They want to be in control of their own operations. But for the next decade, maybe two, I think it will always be a hybrid model. So you've got work to do, guys, basically.
Yeah. And I'll fall squarely in the middle here in the sense that I think the expectation for cell therapy is very similar to what it was in the early days in biotech and monoclonal antibodies. And when you get to a point where the economics are right and the control is there, that large pharma certainly is going to want to hold that. There is a partnering model that spans geography as well, which is something I think that large pharma is much more giving much more consideration today, where on a regional basis they would have their own facility in one geography and utilize another contract manufacturer for manufacturing in a second geography. We've actually proposed serving as part of a regional system where our East Coast facilities could cover the East Coast of the United States, and companies that want to build in the West Coast can have their facilities there. And if you talk to people like Osman, who was heading up the group at Novartis, for their products at Team Unity, they're very much insistent upon owning the manufacturing science and the technology and controlling their efforts to bring the best cost of goods. So I think there's a hybrid role for CMOs long term, and participating with a CMO can often provide that platform technology, which is going to be valuable.
I would like to stress at one point, taking it a bit further. For the next 10 years, I agree with what we said. The following 10 years, if autologous cell therapy works, the whole model has to change. It will go to the hospital. It will go towards the patient. So there will be technologies that will allow decentralized manufacturing, getting it close to patients, and dropping the price dramatically, making it available. And if you think of that model, it's again, goes through this right now, get as fast as you can to clinic with someone who can help you get as much manufacturing as you can, but think what's going to be in 5-10 years down the road, and it has to be a change towards the bedside.
So in that sort of model, that would be outsourcing by definition then, or would the big pharma companies be more involved in a sort of bedside manufacturing unit? How would that work?
So coming from a non-pharma company, so I can't represent their position, but it will have to change. So how, there's a big debate about it, what is GMP, how do you change it, the regulation, etc. But an example model would be they would own the process, they would own the vectors, and then you'd have a device, and you buy a kit from them, and the hospital manufactures that. Who releases it is a question of who's responsible. It's a question for the regulators that will have to adapt. But you could think of decentralized, of computer softwares that from the distance you can really sense and release. But the model is going to change. It's now we're going to manufacture and send it ready. Something is going to, we might just say, right, have the IP. We might just have the vector. We might sell you a kit. But that would be the model.
So in that vision, or in that potential future, that would kind of make the traditional CMO, CDMO role slightly redundant, no? David? Oh.
So, I think it really depends on the stage of development of the industry. And I think in the short term, we don't know what that transition looks like. But if we're to think of parallels today, just in the hospital group of facilities I have to look after, there's parallels in medical imaging. So GE come and give you a MRI scanner. It sits there, and you buy the consumables and equipment from somebody else. So that's sort of the model Ohad was describing, and I agree. The other one in that role, there's not really any role for the CDMO other than perhaps producing some of the reagents, but probably Thermo will make them or somebody else. But there is a hybrid, which is things, say, in other forms of imaging, like the when you use technician for bowel scans or whatever, literally the pharma company comes in, gives you the unit, checks it every couple of days, and then actually there is almost like a CMO-like role there, as well as the consumable, as well as the QA/QC. So I think we'll see things emerge, but I'm not necessarily sure they're models that CMOs will want to go for, because if you're a CMO who's solely doing cell and gene therapy, you may want to move in that way. But I can't imagine that any CMO that's just doing cell and gene therapy today will only be doing cell and gene therapy tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think the one other consideration is that many of these cell therapies represent a platform approach. Not all of the platforms are going to be approved simultaneously, and the expense of administering on a broad distributed basis approved cell therapies is a model that, as far as I know, doesn't exist yet from a regulatory standpoint, and where it would fall in terms of regulation. But I think there's also the movement, and perhaps it's premature to go that direction, but for allogeneic products that may in fact have that benefit of a central manufacturing environment, in which case the CMO would still play a logical role. There are folks that have considered a dramatic change in the CMO's reach in the context of operating a franchise where you would potentially manage the treatment centers or the cell centers that would receive the patients. There's lots of challenges in terms of collection and distribution and those logistics. And those are not insignificant in terms of the cost of goods, nor are the testing menus that are required for these products. So I think there is the potential and the hope for a bedside administration and processing of these cell therapies. The technology isn't quite there yet to allow us to envision how that's going to play out. But it does call for a potential change in the way the CMO operates. The exciting part is that if these kind of pioneering products are successful, then there's a whole range of follow-on products, directed at solid tumors, you name it, and kind of hyper-personalization of cellular therapy. And folks like Steve Rosenberg, who was really pioneering the tumor-infiltrating lymphocyte technology, believes that we're going to see more personalization rather than less personalization, and that could include allogeneically produced cell therapies that potentially are edited at the bedside. Who knows? So it's an exciting time, and I think it does challenge us to think about what the CMO is going to be doing and what the client is going to be doing or the producer is going to be doing down the road.
How much are to what extent do the logistical challenges which cell and gene therapies pose, how much is that going to affect the way these therapies are produced in the future? I mean, is this going to back up the idea of a decentralized model further, or are we just going to have to clamp down on it? What's going to happen there? David?
Right, okay, I get the best question. So I think that there's really two parts to the logistics issue. So one is, how do you get the material you need in the autologous model to your processing facility? And the other one is, how do you get it back out? And you could also argue there's a third bottleneck, which I think my colleagues here referred to, which is that final fill and finish in the hospital, pharmacy, bedside, or whatever that is, where the duty of care passes over. I think that getting World Courier to take some material from a patient bedside and take it back to a processing facility, that's not too hard. Making sure that you've got good suite management and really good planning to make sure you've got a high efficiency facility, but also you don't lose material or don't meet the patient need, that's the big risk. And to what extent capacity planning is even possible is very difficult, because actually you want some excess capacity to allow for growth, but actually things, say infectious diseases, we've seen lots of other viral oncolytic viruses coming down the platform, which are actually quite seasonal. How you plan for that is very, very difficult. I think at the latter end, though, in terms of distributing back to the hospital, that's less of an issue. I think that's something where we say, do World Courier have enough, resource to do this? And the answer is probably yes, or they'll adapt to it. And that final hospital fill and finish, I think ultimately it will probably end up in the pharmacy rather than the operating theatre, which is challenging in itself because most pharmacists have never seen a gene therapy. So I think all these are problems which are nice to have if we get to that level of capacity issue, but definitely worth thinking about.
Ohad and Alan, how are you coping? How are you managing the logistics challenges at the moment? I know it's still early days, but what are your thoughts there?
So the logistics right now, as you said, because they're all early days, they're easy. It's compared to, because you have a certified nurse who's waiting for that product. She's been trained on how to thaw it. The patient has been, there's a whole CRO looking over that patient to make sure that it receives it. But now just think of a few years down the road, the pharmacy could be 3 blocks away, and you thaw the cells. Now the patients have to be ready. Most of the cell products that I know that are frozen and thawed have about a shelf life of 2 to 3 hours from thawing, if you don't put them in the culture media, etc. And that looks like a lot of time, but 3 blocks away, the pharmacy thaws it. Now they have to send it over, and now the patient doesn't feel that well. He didn't arrive. The physician is inside the operation room. This is going to be a huge challenge. And even now, based on my experience, there are quite a few batches that almost don't get to target. And even with allogeneic, which is simpler, it is going to be, from my perspective, it's going to be a major task of how to get that done correctly. And it goes back to the process development. So if there's an issue there, let's look at how do we store it, how do we simplify it in a way that it's a device that it comes in a, pre-filled syringe, whatever. So only near the bedside you can thaw it, meaning changing the way the hospital works. Not simple.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think not to neglect the logistics up front. One of the realities is that the patients that are receiving certainly the autologous CAR T therapies represent a broad spectrum of health conditions. Some are severe, and some are less ill, if you will, have endured less aggressive treatments. And often the collection from the patient shifts, and that requires a shift in the manufacturing schedule. It means your quality control team that's waiting for a package to arrive at 4 p.m. is not going to be utilized, and it's being rescheduled actively at the clinical site. And so it presents a resourcing challenge. I think that we've started to look at relationships with folks that are good at logistics and distribution, people that have mastered the supply chain and are capable of providing, real-time tracking information. We're working with the companies that have the tracking software systems. And that's all going to be requisite going forward, particularly if you're going to try and optimize the throughput of the manufacturing facilities. So the upfront logistics are very critical. I agree with Ohad. Getting the package to the hospital is not so much a challenge, but having a hospital or I should say a physician or a nurse-friendly presentation of the therapy, developing cryopreservation medias that are appropriate for the product, so that you can pull it out, thaw it, and stick it in a bag, or hook a bag up to the delivery. And all of these are things that can be solved down the line. There just has not been the pressing need to do it. So I think it's, from my standpoint, those are going to become simpler as we move forward. And if there are alternative methods for transduction of cells that are non-viral, then there's a different level of complexity with both manufacture, transport, and delivery of these materials.
So these are all challenges that I guess are going to have to be sorted as industry ramps up. I'm sorry, there's a question down there. Okay, I think we've got a microphone. somewhere. I'm sorry. We've got a very kind of an impromptu microphone there. Can we? We just can't quite hear from up here.
I think I heard the question was, what impact will closed systems have on both the manufacturing as well as the delivery of cell therapies? Is that okay? Ohad, that's all yours.
Closed systems. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So the mic. So basically, I think it's a critical role. Right now, what we do in the clean rooms is art. And you have artists, very trained artists to do that, with a huge QC team and QA team that supervises that to approve that. We have to move out of it as quick as possible. And the first step is closing, then automating. Automating will come with probably sensing and artificial intelligence behind it, and that will be the next jump. But the first jump is closing it, because then you're eliminating a lot of these overheads, you're eliminating a lot of those risks, and you're shortening the time, even just the review time, because there's no issue of you're waiting for some kind of a contamination in the room that someone saw in one play, and should we release or not? This will cut that down, and of course, you need lower infrastructure. So you need a grade D and not a grade B or whatever. It's totally different. It will drop down the prices. It will make it more available. I think this is the first critical step to do in whatever process that we do right now.
And that was shown by Plurist then, was it not? They underwent a project looking at closed systems and automation quite recently.
Right. So part of it, it's still not fully closed, but even that, fully automated. But even with what that was done there, you definitely see the reduction in cost around it. So around people and around disqualification of batches, etc. And there's a published case study from about 3 or 4 years ago that the CFO and myself wrote then on these little changes, how dramatically they impacted, and that's an allogeneic process. Think of an autologous that you have many of those every day. I think Lanza Nina, that gave a talk earlier, did a calculation. If you want 10,000 patients a year, that's 70 every day. So think of the amount of processes. It's like 300 or something procedures a day. It's crazy. You can't really scale that. You can't really do that as long as it's open.
David, any thoughts on that?
So I agree with everything Ohad said regarding the technicality and what that technical solution will be. And I agree, various guises of AI, machine learning will all be applied in manufacturing suites in the future, and it's logical it extends to the hospital. But I think that's the technical solution. I think, unfortunately, we're going to end up with an equipoise between the technical solution and the reimbursement. Because when you're looking at things which are bedside care, each thing will have a reimbursement code, the procedure will have a reimbursement code, and then there will be payment by results on the API itself. Therefore, even though it might make the most economic sense to the system to do some of the things Ohad said, I think we're probably going to end up in the middle, whereby actually there's a variety of incentives for people to use a certain number of devices, to make it last a certain amount of time, and to do it in a certain class of environment. Because the hospital planning cycles, 35 years is what I'm used to. And talking about cell and gene therapy at the moment, it's like, let's build another clean room so we can bill it out at top capacity. The last thing in some ways they want to hear is we can, do it in a closed box by the bed.
Does that answer your question? Okay, so we kind of talked about some of the challenges, some of the tech issues to come. Let's hone it back down and talk about where we are right now. Recently, I think it was a PharmaSource report put the number of CDMOs offering cell and gene therapies at around 30 globally. Surely there are huge bottlenecks with the amount of investment in cell and gene therapies, the amount of biotechs are looking at developing products and starting to move these into the clinic. Are we under capacity?
30.
So I guess I'll take this one and say, yes, I do think we are under capacity. So these guys, have got plenty of work on. But I think that there's two types of issues. So one is fundamentally, do we have enough capacity or not to do process development, get the tech transfer, and then do GMP and then meet the need thereafter? I think the other type of capacity we have, frankly, is just a lack of knowledge. I think, and this is my perception, I never worked in monoclonals, I'm a cell and gene therapy and vaccine guy. Whenever I have taken a vaccine to a CMO, it's had a relatively defined process, it's had a few predicates, if you will, and people kind of know what they're meant to hand over. You take a cell therapy to you guys, and everyone is completely bespoke, and it's like getting a tailored suit. So when people complain it takes 8-9 months to get an MSA, and by that point, actually, there's no suite capacity, I don't blame the CMO, and I also don't blame the product developer. It's just that those lags are where the inefficiencies are, and that's before we even get to the suite issue. But you guys run them, I don't know what your thoughts are.
I think there's a lot of truth to what you say in terms of some of the cell therapies, that they are very unique. But to some extent, I flash back to making monoclonal antibodies in mouse ascites. If we think about the progression towards a standard format, ultimately the industry developed some standardization around Chinese hamster ovary cells, and there is emerging, at least in the CAR T space, some sense of similar platform for the production of those kinds of autologous cells. I think another point is that the reality is, and having seen cell therapy from the early days, the field has never enjoyed this level of interest or funding or technology development and advancement, and it's happening very quickly. So I think we're going to see a lot of change over the next few days. In terms of capacity, there is a real need for folks who have knowledge of the intricacies of aseptic processing and cell therapy production, particularly things like iPSCs, where you can have a very challenging, kind of long-winded process to get to the targeted cell population that you want. I see that as more of a constraint right now. I'm lucky enough to work at a company that likes to build ahead of capacity, and so physical capacity at this point, it doesn't seem to be as much of a challenge, but the resource capacity, I think, is one that is going to exist for a few years until we start training, as we did in biotechnology, basically cytotechnologists that are capable of performing GMP processes with cell therapies.
One point to take in consideration, even 30 sounds a big number, and I don't know 30. I guess there's about 10 major ones that are active, and when we say major, I think the biggest one are you guys, and that's what, 20-something rooms, right? Yeah. So
we've got we're sitting on about 250,000 square feet of
yeah, but that's
manufacturing
suites
right now.
But we're talking suites, and the suite is per product. So I don't know, 100 suites all around. There's about 1,000 clinical trials. So there is, even though we don't feel it immediately, you can still find some places to do. There's going to be a lack of capacity, and then it's going to diverse wrong. And as my colleague said, the issue of knowledge and people that can do it correctly, that's the biggest gap that will take a few years to close. And one other point that we're missing, it's not the same thing. So every product is unique. Every CAR T is different, but a CAR T and an MSC and an IPS is a totally different thing. We're putting everything together, cell and gene therapy, saying, yeah, there's enough capacity, or we're limited a bit, but everyone is a different industry. It's dramatically different, and so there is the biggest gap.
And I guess there's going to be a lack of talent with that as well, with such a new sort of, many different types of therapies, and there's already a shortage of general sort of biomanufacturing workers. But for something as new as these therapies, where is industry, where are CMOs, where are big pharma, where are they going to get the talent from?
train. So we have in our facility, BIO, we do two things. One, of course, we train internally, the group, the Genesis group, Master Cell, other global network, it's trained by us, but we give that as a service as well. So we train others. There are people that want to do their own, so we train. And I think, and I start seeing these trends. So there's a lack of knowledge. We need to train people. People are being learning it, and you can see the turnaround of people. And I'm lucky because I'm in a space. I'm in Israel. There's only one CMO that operates, so people aren't running out. But I mean, these guys have been suffering, or the management has been suffering. The employees are having a good time because they're just moving around, and it's going to take time till we fill that gap, and it's adding a lot of cost to the industry.
Yeah,
all that moving.
I think one of the things which has helped our recruiting, and we've literally in Philadelphia, I think a year and a half ago, we were at roughly 250 folks. Now we're over 500, approaching 600. We've been able to attract folks from pharma industry. Pharma has gone through some, gyrations. There's been some overhauls, some closures, and it's created a lot of angst to some extent. The other thing which is really helping to recruit is the excitement in this space. The ability to get to know that there's a patient on the other end of the product that you're making, and it's not going to go into a dusty warehouse somewhere and not benefit the patient. I think industry is evolving quickly. I think the pharma industry, for instance, I know we've got persons in the plant that started out with a good understanding of biologics and not a great level of understanding of cell therapies that have learned quickly, and the pace of training is very rapid when you're trying to get a cell therapy rapidly into the clinic. You have to learn a lot. You got to drink from the fire hose, so to speak. And it's evolving. It's going to be some time before the industry is fully, kind of adapted to the unique cell requirements for cell therapy.
David, is there a lack of talent in this space at the moment?
I think there's a huge lack of talent, but I couldn't agree more with what my colleagues have said. I think that there's only one way to learn here, and it's get your hands dirty, right? I don't care if you filed an IND in monoclonals or in virus or in CAR T. The fact you've been there, you've sat in front of the FDA, you've built a collaborative relationship. It's all those soft skills, frankly, and the commitment to just getting stuff done, which is what's most important. In terms of the technicality, I think that there's not a shortage of people who understand the science, basic stem cell science and immunology and otherwise, but that unique blend of, the immunology meets the engineering, I think, is where it's quite challenging, because I think the gap from, chemical engineering to small molecules was small. I think biologics pushed it slightly, but I think the cell therapies push it quite a long way. But all in, and I say this as with a heavy heart, I'd take the person who's worked in pharma and has done a product before, even if it's not a cell therapy, over a fresh scientist at all times. The problem is that's a short-sighted strategy, because over 3 or 4 years you need both. So I think we need to take a portfolio approach to development.
So I promised to go back to manufacturing gaps. I'm curious to know if industry is being supported by the equipment vendors, if industry really knows what it needs to manufacture these therapies, and what sort of support they're getting from the likes of Thermo Fisher or GE or any of the other vendors. I guess from a CMO point of view, how do you feel about your relationships with some of these vendors?
So as I mentioned earlier, definitely they're interested, and they're in the space, and they're looking to innovate, and they're looking to push forward and get a good position. The gap is understanding what we need. We don't know what we need, and they don't know what we need. So there's a need for innovation. There's a need to grow from the bottom. And you start seeing that with some of these companies. that are now jointly working. One example is the CCRM and GE, building this combined activity where companies come, they need a solution, then they're developing it. This is why I, as a development person, and my role in life is not a CMO, is not a manufacturing, even though I did it. It's to develop technologies for this industry. But the reason I joined with a CMO was because you have to have that hands-on. You have to be there to understand the science, to understand the needs in the GMP, and then to learn how to talk with an engineer. And that's a huge gap. We're all scientists. We don't know how to talk with engineers. We don't know how to explain what we want. We don't even know how to envision it. So I do see these guys coming in. It's still a question mark how this will work, but they definitely are moving in, and that's very encouraging, and I'm quite sure you're going to see the results soon.
And Alan, how are the vendors working with Wuxi?
I think we've got some very good productive relationships, and we've adopted some technology to create platforms. In the viral vector space, we were enamored with the HyperStack platform that's allowing us to produce vector, flexibly with the 36-layer hyperstacks and able to get up to 250 liters from an adherent system. And some folks in the gene therapy space don't need the 2,000-liter reactor yet. They need a limited amount of material because they have early phase studies, and all they need is enough to get through the first phase study. So Corning has been very cooperative and very helpful in that technology. I think the bioreactor companies have awakened. They recognize the potential here. They've been listening to the expectations that the manufacturers have and the requirements for efficient production. The single-use systems are being amenable or are morphing to accommodate things like cell therapies when they really were not, they were considered for monoclonal antibodies. So we're seeing movement from the tool companies. We're seeing a lot of innovation. And again, there is a lot of incentive for them at this point in time because of the commercial successes that they've seen.
David, are you seeing these equipment suppliers helping pharma firms, or do they have a separate agenda?
So firstly, I don't think one can speak ill of equipment suppliers, because without them we can't make what we need. It's like speaking ill of patients. But equally, I sort of come from two sides of the fence. One is that actually I advise a lot of the equipment suppliers, and the second is that I work with a lot of companies who are needing the equipment. And you mentioned the Corning technology. It's great, but there's a 6-month waiting list for some of the stuff and everything else. And you could say the same about some of the Thermal, Sartorius, or GE. Go down your 30, vendors or whatever. I think the challenge is, and we all need to be cognizant of this, is all the tools and technologies companies are taking a bet on the future. Every time, say, a large company moves into this area, they're sinking $10 million in marketing, allocating manufacturing space and everything else. And frankly, they're probably not going to get a return for 5 to 10 years. And it takes 2 years to transition in a new technology into the product line. And then if they want to buy a new technology, if they can't repurpose their existing, that's going to cost them in the current market $100 million plus for anything, because the prices are crazy. So I wouldn't want to be them, but we need them. So I think the question is, how can we work most effectively with them? And of course, it's about having a close relationship like you guys do with Corning, and Ohad mentioned CCRM. I think the key is, let's repurpose wherever we can, because a lot of the time it works, it's already there, it's easy for everybody. And where we can't, that's where we need to prioritize our efforts, because that's where we need co-development.
Yeah. And David, I think you nailed that, and that to some extent, we don't appreciate the complexity of establishing a new production line, for bags and what kind of investment that takes. So there's a lag, certainly, that we're seeing, but I think what's encouraging is that the dialogue has started, and we're starting to talk about these are the kinds of numbers of units that we see in the future, and if we can provide that information to the manufacturers, they're much more willing to offer commitment. So it's certainly, I guess we appreciate that there's work that remains to be done, but we also have some responsibility in trying to give them as much information as possible to justify those big decisions.
So we're coming to the end of this discussion. We've talked about a lack of capacity, we've talked about a lack of talent, problems with logistics, problems with the supply of equipment and the equipment itself and the manufacturing gaps. Let's think back 30 years, monoclonal antibodies. Would we be having the same sort of discussions at trying to work out how to get these new therapeutics out in a similar way, and therefore should we be quite hopeful for the future?
So I think that we should remember there's people in the audience that might not be from cell therapy and might want to come into the industry, so we shouldn't make it sound like it's uninnovative. But the reality is, I think 98% of what we discuss is exactly what happened in pharma. It's gone in monoclonals. It's gone through the classic, Gartner hype cycle. We've gone from adherent to suspension. We've started, with new purification technologies. The only slight difference you could argue possibly is auto-allo, but in reality that's not unsimilar to the cold storage chain issues for the first monoclonals anyway. So I'd like to say that there's very different nuances and they're exciting. You should invest, you should work with us and do all those things, but the reality is there's a huge amount of similarities.
Yeah, I think there is as well, and it's also an encouraging situation in that we were able to solve some of the problems. And some of the problems that we anticipated with the production of monoclonals and recombinant proteins actually disappeared with enhancements in the technology. The upstream production today need not reflect, the huge stainless steel tanks of the early days. And aseptic vialing today, closed vial systems have been a huge benefit. So I think that we're precisely, where the monoclonals and recombinant proteins were in the early days, and that gives us all a lot of hope that there is a simple platform and technology solution going forward.
I would say that even if the gaps seem bigger, we're in the late 2000 and almost 20, and everything is evolving faster. And you can see that. You can see even the companies today, they're willing to talk about, they're willing to innovate, they're willing to test new things because everybody understands that there's a gap. So the technology is moving fast. People are willing to dare and to test and to innovate. And I think even if there's a bigger gap than was in monoclonal, that which I'm not sure, I just wasn't there. But even if there is, it will close the same or even faster just because technology is evolving and people are more open-minded to these kinds of technologies.
I guess finally we've got a couple of minutes. Does anyone have a question to the panel at all? Yep, in the corner. We have a microphone over there.
Hi, thanks. Alan, I think you mentioned that the CMO field has really done a great job in kind of getting up to speed on making these autologous cell therapies, kind of these per patient production runs. Do you think the CMOs are ready for an allogeneic setting where you're looking at maybe hundreds, maybe thousands of doses per run, and kind of all the complexities, upstream, downstream, fill finish, cryopreservation? It's a different ballgame.
Yeah, absolutely. There we go. Absolutely. My mic is acting up. Absolutely, and speaking from my company's perspective, we were tasked to design facilities that could accommodate autologous cell therapies, allogeneic cell therapies, as well as, for instance, exosome products that would require large-scale bioreactor production. So we've built facilities that are flexible in that context. They're able to support autologous production. They're able to support allogeneic cell manufacturing in bioreactors at a 1,000-liter scale. With, you hit on it. You can't fill a bunch of vials and not have inspection stations ready to do that. And what that translates to is a very complex basis of design for some of your facilities. And it also requires segregation of facilities so that we have separate facilities for gene-mediated cell therapies and separate facilities for autologous and allogeneic non-gene-mediated cell therapies from an inspectional practicality standpoint. We were actually one of the first companies to purchase one of the Aseptic Technologies L1 filling units. And unfortunately, the company that was driving that had some challenges in their clinical programs. They had to cancel the order, but the facility was designed to support it. So there is, one of the greatest challenges we have is not painting ourselves into a corner today with the technology and the products. So we're very much focused on the capability of supporting successful autologous as well as allogeneic products.
I would add to that basically autologous raised in the last 3 years with the hype and everybody's talking about CAR T, etc. But we've been doing this stuff. Allogeneic was the earlier wave, and even though it evolved slower with technologies, it did evolve. So many of the challenges have been already there, and some of them have solutions. And you can look at Bioprocessing International, I think 10 years ago, published a few papers. Some of them came from the PPD, some other, on these challenges, because then that was the hype. So absolutely there are solutions. Not everything is solved, but there are definitely, I think all the CMOs, or most of them, are definitely ready to do that.
We have run out of time unless David's got a very brief thought on that.
I've got nothing meaningful to add in any way, other than worst case scenario, people are bad at planning, they get awful facilities, we just end up stratifying the 13 to those that can, those that can't, and it's a boutique for those that are left. That's it.
Well, with that, there are obviously a lot of challenges approaching this industry, but there seems to be quite a lot of hope as well. I'd like to thank our panelists here today, and I'd like to thank you all for attending as well. So, thanks.
Thank you.